I am Elizabeth Sutton, and I'm the director of the Spurlock Museum. We would like to begin today by recognizing and acknowledging that we are on the lands of the Peoria, Kaskaskia, Piankashaw, Wea, Miami, Mascoutin, Adawa, Sauk, Meskwaki, Kickapoo, Potawatomi, Ojibwe, and Chickasaw nations. These lands were the traditional territory of these Native nations prior to their forced removal. These lands continue to carry the stories of these nations and their struggles for survival and identity. As a land-grant institution, the University of Illinois has a particular responsibility to acknowledge the people of these lands, as well as the histories of dispossession that have allowed for the growth of this institution for the past 150 years. We are also obligated to reflect on and actively address these histories and the role that this university has played in shaping them. This acknowledgement and the centering of Native peoples is a start as we move forward for the next 150 years. Thank you so much for joining us on this beautiful sunny afternoon as we open the exhibit, Sewn in Memory, AIDS Quilt Panels from Central Illinois. Along with my colleagues here at the Spurlock, I would like to thank those who collaborated to bring this exhibit to fruition, especially the Greater Community AIDS Project of East Central Illinois, especially Mike Brenner and Jerry Carden, History Harvest and the Department of History, especially Professor Catherine Overdeck, Illinois Public Media, especially Kimberlie Kranich, Kurt Bielema, Andrew Reynolds, DJ Roach, and Liz Westfield. Journalism at Illinois, especially Professor Charles Ledford, Uniting Pride of Champaign County, the National AIDS Memorial, and financial support provided by the Dr. Alan C. and Marlene S. Campbell Fund. So I hope you please join me now in welcoming Kimberlie Kranich, Director of Engagement and Educational Outreach at Illinois Public Media, and Stretch Ledford, the Associate Professor of Journalism, to our stage. They are the collaborators who worked together so well to create the videos that are now displayed with our exhibit that are both oral histories and biographies of some of the men featured in these quilts. Kimberlie and Stretch.
Thank you, Elizabeth. Hello, everyone. Thank you for coming to remember those men who died of AIDS during the 80s and early 90s when basically it was a death sentence. Many men who received this just didn't have a lot of hope. There weren't a lot of drugs. Drugs were toxic. It wasn't until gay men started to make noise and make changes in our health policy and demanded drugs that we have changed both for them and our health system today, and gay men caring for each other when there was no place to go, and others joining with them. So we remember this 40 years later from the first case of AIDS in this country. And when I found out that History Harvest and their students were interested in researching LGBTQ history, and at the same time my friend Jerry Carden was working with them and was one of our folks who has much of our LGBTQ history in this community. And then Sarah Schulman's book was coming out on the definitive history of ACT UP and AIDS in 1987 through 92, that just was released, that book. Things just kind of came together, and I thought, well, Spurlock is doing this wonderful exhibit, working with all these partners, what can we do? And so I talked to my friend and colleague, Stretch Ledford, and I said, can we work together again? Can we bring students in, and can we take this honoring, this quilt, the love that's still here for the people who are memorialized on the quilt, and can we do even more? Can we find people who knew these men who are no longer with us? Can we tell with the students a little bit more of their story? No story is going to be comprehensive, but can we do a little more? And can we maybe find more people to tell more stories? Because the History Harvest Project, and WILO's website, and GCAP, we're all going to be working on this for a longer period of time so that history can be known to others. And what was so important to us was to have young people know this history. They weren't born when this AIDS crisis was first really a crisis. And of course, it's still with us, right? We still have 13-some thousand cases of AIDS, or more than that. I think it's 30,000. So we wanted to help the young people connect to that story and to understand what that's like and to apply that knowledge to what's going on today. And so that is what happened. And in just a few moments, we're going to show you 3 of the videos that they created. As Elizabeth said, it started with oral histories, bringing people into the studio, talking with them for 1.5 to 3 hours, just talking about their lives and making sure we ask questions about AIDS in central Illinois during that time. And then from those larger oral histories, which will eventually appear on the History Harvest site and WILL's site, the students then made these smaller pieces about the men on the panels based on what their loved ones said. And that's what you're going to see today. And we're so happy the students and Spurlock has those videos in a kiosk. So today we're here to remember, we're here to connect, and we're here to thank the love that made it possible, the anger that made the movement possible, which brought attention, and to connect that to what's going on today. So I will let Stretch say a few words, and then we'll introduce you.
Yeah, so I'll jump back in maybe after the first one.
Okay, that's fine.
And they're short. They're each about 2 minutes, maybe a little bit longer, 2 to 3 minutes. But I'll jump in and share a couple of things about how all this came together and after the first one, between the first and the second.
Thank you. And before we show the Bobby, I want to just tell you a quick, I want to set this up. So as is the case, Jerry and others were contacting people who lived here and knew the men and then moved away. And everyone we contacted, the students contacted, they were so happy to be involved. And there wasn't a person that did not cry when they thought about this terrible time and their loved one that was lost and other loved ones that were lost. One gentleman gave us a huge list of people he knew who died of AIDS, their birth date and their death date. But there were also people that didn't want to talk because of the pain of, in this case, the religious teaching that separated siblings from each other, separated other family members because of the belief that this was a sin, that these men who were gay and lived and loved together and worked on a farm and then died, and then the one family brought the deceased Pat back up to Wisconsin where he was from, and Bobby, his lover, was buried in Ivesdale. And we asked for help in Ivesdale, and we had a librarian who put something out, and a relative said, yes, I'll talk to you. Not fully on the record, but enough that we could see pictures of these men, these lovers, these partners. And so this is what you're going to see in the first video. And if we could play that, this is the video of Bobby and Pat.
Pat was tall and dark, and Bobby was short, blonde, and cute. And they'd been together quite a while, if I recall correctly. And Bobby was a farmer. That's why the John Deere tractor is on the quilt. And everybody that was local that knew them always identified him first as a farmer, because it was such an unusual vocation for a gay man to have.
Sometimes I would go down to their farm, and they had a machine shed the size of a small city. And Bobby was probably only 5'6", if that. He was a small man, but he handled that farm equipment, big tractors and everything. He maintained that farm. I never knew him to have hired help. He did all the work himself. Bobby got up, went to the farm. Pat got up and drove to Muhammad to work on the antique shop, and refinishing furniture. So, I mean, that was their life. And they did a lot of gardening. They had a huge garden. I mean, Pat used to bring produce to Muhammad just to give it away. Next to his shop, there was a place called the Gray Goose. It was fresh food. And Pat would provide her with all the fresh produce from their garden.
We used to go to a big New Year's Eve party at Walter and Frank's. They lived north of Muhammad. They had a huge property and a huge house, and they would do a sit-down dinner for about 20 gay men on New Year's Eve. And Pat and Bobby were there frequently. We were at their table a few times, had great conversations with them.
So I'm going to introduce the next one. So that's Pat and Bobby. What you weren't able to hear in that video because the family member was willing to share, but not on the record, is that a relative, when Bobby was in Carl Hospital dying from AIDS, and the two men died within months of each other, a family member of Bobby's worked at the hospital, and she would sneak up at night through the back door to visit her brother. That was the only way she could do that. So the next video is a video of Greg Downey, who, his mother, Georgia King, is Georgia here? Georgia here? Okay, this video is told through the eyes of Greg's mother, Georgia, from Monticello. And this is an example where you have a mother who loved her gay son and was able to eventually tell people that he died of AIDS and do a lot for the community that he was part of after his death. It was a promise she made to him. So the students interviewed her, and let's take a look at this video from the perspective of the mom, Georgia.
As many years has gone by, you would think I'd have my emotions in check, but I don't. You know, it's like it just, it doesn't seem like it was that many years ago. It's like it was yesterday. And the pain is still there, and I guess it always will be. Greg was a very loving child, a very kind child. Shortly after, I think he was 7 years old when his father and I divorced. So Greg became like the man in the home. And Greg probably had more responsibility as a young child than maybe he should had, but he grew into a fine young man. He was very dependable, very honest, and he dated girls and everything. And I think he was probably maybe a sophomore in high school. He called me on the telephone. He couldn't even tell me in person. He called me on the telephone. He said, "Mom, you know that thing you've been wondering about me and I keep denying?" I said, "Yes." He said, "I want you to know it's true." And that's how I found out my son was gay. When Greg and I were on one of our trips, before we left there, he did get sick. And I really worried about even being able to get him home. And I did get him home, and he lived in Louisville, Kentucky, and I got a hold of a doctor there and got him in, and they told me that he had AIDS. He did AZT. I think AZT was the first one, and he started having complications, so they took him off of that. And then he went to DDI, which was the second one, and he started having liver problems and everything, so they had to take him off of that. So he was to the point where there really wasn't anything that they could do for him, and that's when I brought him back. My son wanted me to make a difference in his name. He wanted me to educate people, and he wanted me to explain to people how they can and cannot get AIDS. He wanted me to reach out and help people living with AIDS. He said, "Mom, you're a strong woman. I want you to do it for me." And I really tried very hard to do that. He was very frail, and he wanted to see the AIDS quilt in Chicago. And I'm not sure what was going on in his mind. I'm not sure what would be going on in my mind if I were there, and I would know one of these days I was going to be one of those quilt panels. I made Greg's panel myself. It's still hard on me when I see it today, but when I was doing it, I was okay. I was glad to be doing it. I thought it was something that Greg would be happy about. And I didn't want any help with it. I wanted to be the one that did all of it, and I did.
And just a little to add to that, so when her son died, when her son was sick, she would tell people that he had cancer and he died of cancer. And eventually she said he died of AIDS, and she went on and she spoke on panels, and she educated people with gay men from GCAP and other places, and answered questions and educated and loved and worked on a house called Champagne House. So that's a little more about her that you couldn't get from the video. And the last one I'm going to introduce, and the others they're all up there in the kiosk, they're on our website, so feel free to watch them again. This is a video that Stretch and I actually made because we wanted to have the students talk about the process a little bit. And what this video really focuses on are the stories that were untold, the ones they didn't have quite enough information in the timeline that we had to tell what we thought was a comprehensive enough story. So this is really them, about 4 of the students of the 11 we worked with, talking a little bit about that process.
When we talk about the queer community, very rarely do we talk about the queer people who live in rural areas and what it's like to live there now, let alone what it was like to live there in the 80s and 90s. One of the panels I worked on was the panel for Granger. This was a case where we did actually have a first and a last name, and we still knew nothing. Didn't know who made the panel, didn't know anyone who knew Grant. To know that you have this opportunity and you have a name and you even have a last name and you still can't bring this person's story to life is just really, I think, is heartbreaking.
I had David K. French, Benji, and Mike. With David K. French, we found his obituary. And I found other obituaries of people in his family, but there's not really a ton you can go off of when you're looking for people to talk to and you're only finding obituaries. I spent a lot of time trying to make connections, but as a journalist, I didn't want to make connections that I couldn't prove with 100% accuracy. So Benji, we know he's from Arcola, Illinois, and he went to Arcola High School. Our team found where his tombstone was located, and we also made a couple of Google searches and found the potential number to contact his mom. And we called a couple of times and we didn't receive any responses, so that was another dead end. We worked on Mike, but there was just nothing. We didn't have a last name, we didn't have a panel maker. Mike is an incredibly common name. I was looking through some of the books from when the memorial quilt was in Washington, D.C. There are columns and columns of names, just first names, like you'll have 20 Stevens, no last name, and so we just couldn't find anything on him.
With Chuck Harshbarger, we never did find much about him. It's sad to put his panel alongside other individuals that we did uncover things about.
We weren't even sure that his last name was Harshbarger for quite a bit of time. And then we drove to what we thought could have been his hometown, and we looked through the cemeteries for like any Chuck or Charles Harshbarger.
These are people whose stories were ignored and downplayed for so long. So many people didn't talk about AIDS. So many people kind of pretended AIDS wasn't happening. So many people took the attitude like, well, these amoral, sinful gay men, this is their punishment. And so many of their stories were lost.
People hear like the AIDS epidemic, they think New York, San Francisco, big cities, Washington, D.C., but they don't think of Champaign-Urbana and fathers, partners, lovers, friends, sons, they all died. It's happened here, and it's still here. It's not going away. That's just part of history.
I'm going to reintroduce my colleague, but before I do, I just want to say that, Stretch said yes immediately when I asked to work with him, and without his help, we wouldn't have the students. They worked really hard, and then they went for a break, and then we had this deadline with Spurlock, so Stretch finished them off, polished the videos, made sure that we had them in time, so I want to personally thank Stretch for this partnership.
So Kim is amazing, and thankfully, we had worked together on Downstate Vietnam Stories. And what year was that, 2016, 17? And that was a student partnership also, where I recruit my students from multimedia. I teach multimedia, photojournalism, so it was a great collaboration. And so when Kim approached me about this, there was no way to say no. I mean, this sort of thing, having students hear the stories that the folks whom they interviewed told about events that changed their lives and were part of a change in history 40 years ago. There's no way to do that in a classroom. It's impossible to give them the resonance of being able to step back in history and learn about something that they knew about, but they learned, I did too, a hell of a lot more about the AIDS epidemic than I knew I didn't know. But they learned that in a visceral way. And I just this is the sort of thing that this university can do at its best, which is collaborate, bring people together from different departments, different areas of expertise, and collaborate on something that has value to the community, has value to history. It's said that journalism is the first chapter of, journalists write the first chapter of history. But I think this is a good example of not just the first chapter, right? Maybe there are later chapters, because this is part of the story. It's just a later chapter. So, but being able to do this was a gift, and so community facing, part of history, but also the students learn a lot and learn about themselves. And I'm just so incredibly grateful to be able to be part of this, and especially as an LGBTQ ally. Thank you for letting me do it.
Kimberlie and Stretch just wanted to say thank you so much for finding and recording these stories. It's so very important. Thank you. And next we will hear from Jerry Carden, who's the co-founder of the Gay Community AIDS Project and our community curator of the Sewn in Memory exhibit. Jerry?
Thank you, everyone, so far for the wonderful and heartfelt presentations. And it's been awesome working with Kimberlie and Stretch and Catherine and everybody else that I've met along the way through this process. I have some slides that I'm going to share with you today, and they kind of tell the story. And if you ask my husband, Tim Temple, of almost 41 years tomorrow, and I'll speak a little bit more about that during one of the slides. But I think most of you that know me know that if I start speaking free range, that you're going to be in for a long haul. So the slides help keep me focused. And one of the things that I really, and we can go ahead and bring up the first slide, because it's really just, it's about the exhibit, which is why we're here. And when people come into the exhibit, they might think that that's all that GCAP was about. And Tim is pointing to me, do I need to do something with the mic? Yeah. I was given permission to take the mask off. He's always watching out for me. And I wanted to be sure that people left here today, especially the younger ones that maybe didn't understand about what was going on during that whole era of the 80s. In terms of the quilt panels were a side benefit of what was going on. And I want to give you that run up to what happened even before we began seeing the cases of AIDS, because it's really an important part of LGBTQ history. So if I have everything working correctly here, and I was trying to make sure I didn't drop the lavalier mic and that I got my slide mover turned on. Okay, it's working because the laser pointer's working. Okay, now I can go. So the Greater Community AIDS Project, you'll hear a little bit about the name change, but it started out in 1985, and it was called the Gay Community AIDS Project. I was the founding chair, but there were a number of men in the community and women who felt like we really needed to do something. We were several years into the AIDS pandemic. And the Greater Community AIDS Project, the Gay Community AIDS Project became the Greater Community AIDS Project around 95, 96. It was a controversial period of time. I won't go into that, but you can imagine those of us that formed it as the Gay Community AIDS Project. It was a message to the larger community that the gay men and the affiliated allies working with us were doing something to help ourselves. Because early on in that pandemic, as you heard Owen Henderson say, not everybody, we had a lot of allies, but there were people that just wanted to see us die and go away and not speak about that topic anymore. And the Greater Community AIDS Project, we felt the name change was important, and I came around to that. And the reasoning was it was difficult for us to make inroads into the Black community because there's such stigma in the Black community about the term gay. And Joan Lathrop, who we were working with at Champaign County Public Health and was part of the Champaign County Community Task Force on AIDS, really encouraged us to make that change. And in respect for her and in hoping to reach a larger community, that was part of the name change. And I am making a commitment to capture more of the GCAP history over the next several years, and I'm hoping that some of the collaboration that has started so far, and many of you have heard me say this, it grew organically. I did not set out to have all these different groups involved. It just so-and-so knew so-and-so knew so-and-so who kept moving it on into different sectors of the university. But I'm getting ahead of myself and I need to stick to my slides. So this is a portion of a presentation that I did for last year, well, this last Pride Fest in September of 21. Because Mike Benner, and I know Mike is here, he is the current executive director for GCAP. I want Mike to either raise his hand or stand up as well. And I know there's at least one board member with you, Laura, right? Chorus. And I'm going to be working with the GCAP board to help get more of that history together. Because right now, we do have a lot of information, but it's very sketchy, and it's sometimes in people's basements and file boxes, etc. And we're going to focus on that. So the presentation that we did was outdoors. It was a very windy day. They had us set up in a tent that kept flapping so much that it was hard for people to hear. But I wanted to make sure that we had the Champaign-Urbana Public Health District represented because they were instrumental in helping us get going with GCAP. And at the time, it was Joan Lathrop. And Julie Pride, I wanted to be sure and shout out because Julie wasn't an employee of the Public Health District quite yet. She was getting her BS and MSW around that time and looking for projects. And because of a friend of hers from her hometown who had been diagnosed with AIDS, she felt compelled to get involved with working with public health. And that was her foray into public health. And those of you locals know that Julie Pride is our queen of public health. don't think Julie is here today, but thank her. And Mike also was talking about the current work of the Greater Community AIDS Project, because there's still work to do. And I'm just going to be focusing on the beginning because I was told I had 20 minutes. So in setting the stage for AIDS and the formation of GCAP, I'm sure every year around the anniversary of Stonewall, people begin to hear about Stonewall was kind of the stepping out of the shadows for the gay community. And we won't go into too much more about that, but it was really the beginning of the 70s when we had gay liberation. Many people were coming out of the closet, and that also meant that people were enjoying that freedom and becoming more sexually active. But little did we know that there was a deadly virus that lurked. That wording is screwy. Virus lurked during the last part of the 70s. And we began to see that in 1981. And one of the reasons we had a push for this year was this is the 40th anniversary of the first cases of, we didn't even know it was going to be called AIDS. Because back then it was called the gay cancer, the gay plague, GRID. There were all different kinds of names for it. The research was slow. We didn't have the internet. So Tim and I, just to give a little bit of history, I was drinking heavily when I first met Tim. I was with somebody else and decided I really needed to quit drinking and get into a relationship with somebody that meant a lot more to me than the guy I was with. And so it was end of January 1981 when we finally decided that it was time to be part of a relationship. And around August of that year, I believe it was, we began hearing about those first cases. Well, we were a new couple, and you can imagine as a new couple, you're interested in doing certain things, but then all of a sudden you're told no. Nothing was known. Saliva, all the other bodily fluids, respiratory. So it was a difficult time to start a relationship. But I know that because of my prior behaviors, if I hadn't met Tim, I wouldn't be standing up here today. I would probably be at Quilt panel in the other room. So this is one of the reasons I am very committed to this project and making sure that we document the history. So the early 80s, those of us in Champaign-Urbana were hearing the reports from New York, from Houston, from Chicago, San Francisco, about all the cases that were being seen. And again, no internet, so we relied on the gay press. There was a paper magazine that people took called The Advocate. The morbidity and mortality weekly report was beginning to carry information, the medical journals, and so we had to comb all of those kinds of things in order to come up with the information. And here in the Midwest, we think, oh, let's hope that that trend of fashion from the West Coast or the East Coast doesn't make its way here. But you know what, it always does. And this wasn't trends in fashion, this was something else that we thought we better be prepared. But we didn't really see cases locally until around '83. I was working for Burnham Hospital at the time as a health educator. That was my bachelor's degree. I got a degree in health education while actively alcoholic. Go figure. And I just felt compelled to do something when a friend of mine was diagnosed, because it meant, okay, it is coming here. And we do not have his panel. There was a duplicate of a panel that I made, and it's at the AIDS National Memorial Quilt, and we don't know what happened to the local panel. And if just around the first corner of the exhibit, there are some small pictures of panels that are displayed, and the guy's name is Jimmy Walters. He cut hair in downtown Champaign, and he was working with Tim Sharp, who many of you know started the Tim Lee John salons locally. So another local person, Howard Wexler, was a professor of Chinese history, well known in the university community, and that's when reality hit. And we decided we better start meeting and do something. And that's kind of how GCAP was born. A lot of us that wanted to do either education or provide support services, those were our two main functions that we set out to begin with. And at first it was going to be split apart in those two different functions. And I always have to give a shout out to McKinley Foundation, the McKinley Presbyterian Church and Foundation. Reverend Charlie Schweitzer, who I'm guessing some of you that are a little more in my age range, and Reverend Stephen Shoemaker were instrumental in helping us coalesce, and we were running around just kind of crazed, and we were angry at ourselves, at the universe, and it was hard to focus. And they helped us find that focus to help find the organization and get it going. I think I pretty much covered everything that's on this slide. Joan Lathrop is another saint that I think Joan is still, I haven't heard otherwise. Joan is still at Clark Lindsay Village, and we contacted Joan because we really wanted to do an oral history with her, but her health is not such that it was going to be feasible for her. But we know her heart is still with us, and she bucked all kinds of guff from the Champaign-Urbana Public Health Department, because at the time they were headed up by a very homophobic, I won't use names, but a very homophobic administrator, and did not want to touch AIDS because they didn't want to be associated with anything that was gay. And Joan made sure that we got this county task force together, which was a group that met on a regular basis of social service agencies, all the public health services, hospitals, clinics, and the gay community. And she would not do it without having the gay community involved. So, this is, I can't find one of the bus placards. And we had very little money to start off with, but we felt like we needed to get our name out into the community. So with what little money we had, we bought billboards, and the same message was riding around town on MTD buses. And if anybody in their archives possibly has a picture, and I still need to contact the MTD. I'm surprised I haven't done that, but as Kimberlie will tell you, I've been on the phone a lot trying to get people that knew the folks in these panels. Our earliest goals, and they've changed a little bit because the whole pandemic of AIDS, the face of AIDS has changed. But you can kind of read these for yourself. But it was to educate anybody in the community, and we did. The county task force and GCAB formed I call it the dog and pony show. And we would go out to schools, to businesses. I remember the Social Security office had an employee that was diagnosed, and they were so scared to even use the drinking fountain. And we went in there and we did our dog and pony show in terms of how AIDS is transmitted. You know, by that time we really did know a lot more about it. But, and trying to get into the schools, that was another issue, but we did manage in some cases. So those were our early goals. And the early challenges, the stress and fear made it hard to unite our forces. No money. Our early expenses we paid out of our own pockets. I think one of our first sources of income besides our own pockets was Jimmy Walters' service, his mother Olive, and another saint. She made sure that all of the donations came to GCAP for us to do some of that early work. And we had a lot of people working against us, including the representative, the local representative for the state at the time, Tim Johnson. He wanted to make sure that we were cut off from any funding from the state of Illinois Department of Public Health, who was trying to fund us. And the News Gazette was not supportive. I could go on, but I can't in the interest of time. But that's part of the history I want to delve a little bit more into and make sure we capture. I do always want to shout out Paul Wood. I think Paul recently retired, and he was one that bucked the News Gazette in terms of getting favorable stories about the gay community and also about issues of AIDS or other non-popular topics. So what always frustrated me, and still does to a degree, was that this country is so phobic about talking about sex openly. And the public service announcements that were being played on, you know, major networks or ads on magazines, wherever, would say, fight AIDS, get the facts. But you can't talk about the facts. You can't talk about how AIDS is spread because, oh my gosh, that involves talking about sex and bodily fluids. How many people could have been saved if we had been able to talk honestly at the beginning, and even now, I just still can't believe it seems like this, oh well. That's my free range coming out. Okay, some additional activities. We had a quarterly newsletter called the G Capsule and an information phone line that was staffed every evening. And that makes me think about Georgia. God, I love that woman. I was working the phone line one evening, and it was the late 80s because we were still in a different house. And the phone line wasn't an emergency line. It was more or less just to answer people's questions. And a lot of questions we got were men that had been out and did something maybe while they were drinking or maybe not while they were drinking, and they were scared. This is what happened. Do you think I'm going to get AIDS? Well, I don't know. And then you'd have to start talking about, there's no test for it, when there was no test for it. And you're going to have to wait a certain amount of time until blah, 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 blah. Well, one night I got a call from a mother, and she was telling me the story about Greg, that he was in Louisville, and he told her he wanted her to get involved. And Georgia is one of the most dynamic women I have ever met, and she got involved in a big way. I think Georgia was on the board for GCAP for probably all of the history of GCAP, except for a short time when she was taking a little bit of a break. And from what I understand, I think she's back on the board for GCAP, or maybe working on that. I don't know. But I was hoping Georgia would be here today so I could give her another shout out. She helped out so much with GCAP. And so many of us were still scared that we were infected because there was no test those early years. And Georgia had that motherly quality. And when we were working on Champagne House, which was housing for people with AIDS, Georgia would be there every Saturday. And I think people were afraid to not show up because they would disappoint Georgia, because she was always there. And Georgia has a decorating business, and I hope she won't mind my telling you this, but she turns 80 this year. And she still does decorating, and it's not just picking out drapes and wallpaper. She hangs the wallpaper. She gets up on the ladders and does it all. So information phone line helped us make a lot of connections. The newsletter, we had a speakers bureau. I talked about the speakers bureau. Some of them were with the county task force, some of them were separate. The county task force, we did a lot of advertising. We began to get some grants. Tim Johnson wasn't always successful in getting our funding cut. And educational pamphlets we would distribute. And oh my God, that's one of the reasons he wanted to get our funding cut, because we dared use honest language in one of the little trifold pamphlets. And it was designed to go in places where men had sex with other men. I don't want to say just gay men, because there were people that identified as straight because they had a wife and kids at home, but they had another life. And so at the bars or other places, we had a little trifold that you could easily, discreetly slip in the back pocket without somebody seeing you with a great big wad of pamphlets. The Buddies Project, this was the other main arm of GCAP. Ken Bishop, who is not with us anymore, he didn't die of AIDS, but of heart issues, and he was responsible for getting Buddies going. But those early days, if you saw Georgia and her husband wheeling Greg through the quilt panel exhibit, and she talked about him being debilitated, those early cases of AIDS started looking like the survivors from and they didn't all survive from the Holocaust. Just skin and bones, and there was nothing really at those early days that we could do for people. And so providing support, direct physical support for the men that had been diagnosed, and then we branched out and also provided support groups for their loved ones. We did lots of fundraisers. We had a lot of fun doing the fundraisers. There were variety shows. There was a gay men's choral union here in town from 82 to 92-ish, or 94, I guess. And so we would have concerts, and then Amazon joined. Amazon became a group in a few years after the Gay Men's Chorus formed. And so we would do joint concerts. Artists Against AIDS was one of our major fundraisers. And we would have a big venue, like an empty warehouse or an empty building in downtown Champaign or somewhere else. I know when M2 was being built, we had a whole floor of M2 that didn't have anything sold yet. And we just had artwork hanging everywhere and tables full of pottery and ceramics. And that was a huge fundraiser for us. And then Holiday Gala fundraisers, among many more. This is an example of one of our Artists Against AIDS. You can just see artwork hanging. You had to put it up with ladders and take it down with ladders. And the table's full of art objects. Champagne House was another big project. People were losing housing because they might have been kicked out from their home or just couldn't work anymore and had to give up their apartment. And so I need to also shout out the Prairie AIDS Foundation was a group of women in town, and one of the women that I was talking with recently said, "Oh, we just called ourselves the Jewish women that felt like we could raise money from people that you guys couldn't." And so they raised money. They got grants together, and it provided a lot of the initial funding for buying a house. And we don't advertise really where the house is because, especially back then, we didn't want to be any kinds of problems or issues. But I mentioned on maybe many Saturdays and other times, we were there working and getting it ready. And Champagne House is still in existence, still providing services. And Mike would be better suited to tell you more about that because Mike works very closely with the Champaign-Urbana Public Health doing case management for current people with AIDS. And Georgia can't give her enough shout outs. I want to mention Steve Otto. He was kind of our project manager and he was just so level-headed and able to help keep us on course along with Georgia. And then the Names Project Quilt got started. And of course, I think people may be aware that it started as a project in San Francisco, Cleve Jones, and as word about this quilt project grew, it spread across the nation. And people here locally learned about it and started wanting to make quilt panels. There was a group for many weeks that got together at McKinley Foundation and made quilt panels. And some of the ones for people that we really don't know that much history on were made at those, I guess we call them quilting bees. So I just wanted people to know that the quilt panels were an outgrowth of everything else that was happening surrounding AIDS and HIV. And of course, until people actually see the quilt and realize they're 3 by 6. And I'm guessing you probably know that that's the size of a grave. And that's how they were designed to be the size of a grave. And this is, I just had to include Steve Gallagher, one of my dearest friends. I met him in AA. He was also in recovery. And he was a person that worked at the Lamplighter restaurant. Other people that are around town for a long time remember the Lamplighter. He was the maitre d', so he was well known around town. And he also was sometimes found in the morning at the Lamplighter in the wine room, because he was also the wine steward. And so he realized eventually that he needed to get help, and that's how we met in AA. But Steve made the quilt panel. He helped work on the one for Howard Wexler and the one for Mike Hyman. And some of the quilt panels that the students were talking about, we didn't have videos for them because there really weren't people to interview that knew the people really, really well. And Mike Hyman was a bank manager in Rantoul. And once he was diagnosed, he told the people around him, even though it was a small community, and he wanted to educate them. And because he was somebody that was already known and loved in the community. So Steve did the majority of the work on Mike Hyman's panel and on Howard Wexler's. And then, of course, when Steve passed in '91, Steve Otto and I worked together to make the panel for Steve Gallagher. And the panels were used as information to let people know about AIDS, to say that we had these local panels. So you're going to recognize many of these panels out here that were carried on either hay racks. Another gay farmer, Bob Rutledge, would give us a hay rack every year that we could drag through the streets for the 4th of July parade. And that was I guess, what do I want to say? It wasn't done to have a gay group in the 4th of July parade. And there were times that we did have bottles or other things thrown at us and insults hurled, but we just felt it was important to get the word out about GCAP's existence. And over time, the panels were used to loan out to businesses or public offices, government offices, so that we could help advertise that GCAP was around and help keep that message about AIDS going. And that's how some of the panels that we had ended up missing. Because the panels out here, many of them have duplicates that are at the National AIDS Memorial Quilt, and then some of the ones that were lost locally that are now just at the Memorial Quilt. And I guess the other thing that I wanted to mention about the quilt panels is kind of escaping me right now, but that brain cell will wake up in a second. There were a number of exhibitions of small sections of the quilt, and I forget which year it was that the National Mall displayed. It was the last time that they were able to get all the quilt panels displayed. And I think now, according to the website, there's around 50,000 quilt panels, but it's representing over 110,000 names. Because some panels were, maybe they had 5 or 10 or maybe even more names on them. And there was an exhibit at the Illini Union in '94. There were exhibits up at the Navy Pier in Chicago. And typically whenever there was a display of the quilt, there was one in Bloomington at ISU, we would have a bus load or car loads of people going in order to see the sections of the quilt. And some of the ones not in this exhibit, my good friend, the guy that cut my hair, and Jimmy is the reason I decided I had to get involved with helping form GCAP. And I just want to make sure that people know that there are so many people that served as chairs of GCAP over the years that we're going to be capturing history from them. After that first couple of years, I knew I needed to step back or I was risking my sobriety, because it was becoming very stressful. And so I focused more on the education side. So Howard Wexler, the Chinese professor, John Midden, who has a sister living in town, if you know Mary Ann Midden. She was a lawyer that worked for the city, now retired. Ben Kepner was a respiratory therapist that worked at Carl. He was also an awesome pianist, but decided that he was going to make more money if he didn't try to pursue the concert pianist route. And Robert DiCello taught dance, taught ballet through the Conservatory of East Central Illinois. It was a music conservatory and also taught dance. And when the conservatory closed, he continued teaching classes at the Dance at Illinois, the dance program here. And we have the director of the dance program here today, Jan Urquhart. And the way that this exhibit, this project has spread, there's now a Dance 100 class led by El Amadian, who is creating a dance that relates to the exhibit. I met with them Friday morning in terms of coming up with ideas. So we're touching so many different units of the campus. And I should keep moving, but Carl Porchadou has a sister that lives here, and she's very kind of shy and doesn't really like the public spotlight, but she made Carl's panel. We sang in the Gay Men's Chorus together before he moved to Chicago, and another panel that was made for John Midden. Sometimes there was family members that wanted to make a panel, and sometimes friends, co-workers, people that were in school together. So sometimes people had more than one panel. And this is one that's not in our exhibit, but it was made by someone local. I don't know their name. Robert Michael Doyle, if anybody knows him, kind of told me part of the story in that this panel was made. It is at the National Quilt. And I just remembered what I wanted to say about the quilt. And he died alone, and the little town that you can't read from where you're sitting is Streeter. And that emphasizes, I think, again, what the students were saying with the oral histories, is a lot of this is lost. And one of the guys that I felt like was going to be able to help clue me in to many of the people that are on the panels here, he just broke down in tears He's HIV infected himself. He's a long-term survivor. He now lives in Texas. And I just thought, oh, he's going to be right on board. And he broke down and he said, I can't go there anymore. So I respect that, and we move on. We also knew that in having these panels displayed, that more people are going to see these panels, and somebody who, or maybe knew the person directly, that the descriptors next to the panels are designed so that we can keep adding information. Reuben was a good example. We didn't think we were going to find anything about Reuben. And through friends of a friend of a friend, the 6 degrees of separation, we found out that Fred Faraday, who I actually knew lived here years ago and is a social worker, knew Reuben, and he and a couple other people made the panel for Reuben. And if you haven't read the description about Reuben, you really should read it. It's very powerful. So that's the end of my slides for today. And I know I took more than 20 minutes. Oh well, I think they knew that when they asked me. Thank you so much for coming. And I can't thank the Spurlock staff enough. When we were first rolling these panels out and photographing them down here on the stage, when I saw Merrill's and Stevens, 2 really good friends, I broke down, and I wasn't expecting that. It's just, I know I've said it before, but this means so much, and how it grew from Catherine Oberdeck. I think Catherine is here. Raise your hand, Catherine. This started by going to her history harvest class and talking about local LGBTQ history, and it grew from that to the bringing the quilt panels over here, and somebody said, oh my gosh, we're not just going to photograph them, we're going to do a display. And then Kimberlie and Stretch getting involved with the journalism students, and there's more that's going to be happening, I think, through Illinois Public Media and the dance department, and I think I'm missing something that got going. But it became a whole community collaborative effort, and we want to see that continue. So spread the word. This exhibit is up until July 10th. And I've done some small tour groups through, and I know that other people here can do the same. What I remembered is that one of the exhibits is actually a set of computers. It looks like a table, glass front, and there's a place where you can skim the History Harvest, you can skim the GCAP website, and you can also skim and look at the National AIDS Memorial Quilt website. And if you know the name of someone, you can plug in their name, and if they have a quilt panel, it will bring that quilt panel up for you, or the actual number of the quilt panel. So I know that, get the hook? Thank you again.
Thank you so much, Jerry. I just wanted to end by expressing that on behalf of all of my colleagues here at the Spurlock, that we're just so very grateful to be a part of this project. Thank you to all of our collaborators. I think what also is very meaningful to us is that this is a living project. It doesn't stop with just the exhibit. It doesn't stop when the exhibit comes down in July. And we're always looking for new people to have new ideas. I know we have a great kind of slate of programming planned, and there's always room for more. So thank you all for coming, and thank you for sharing this with us. We so much appreciate it.